All right, guys, let's talk about a very complex series of motives that pushed Europeans to explore, in spite of the fact that doing so could be enormously expensive. Why would they spend all this money? One primary motivation for exploration was the need for the Europeans to find land on which they could grow crops. In the earliest stages of exploration, the Portuguese explorers sought to expand their own domestic resources by increasing their exploitation of oceanic resources, such as fish and whales. There was also a desire to acquire land that would directly improve their economic situation. This might include finding resources to use back in Portugal like timber, but it was also focused on bringing cultivatable land under their own control. In particular, the Portuguese sought land on which they could grow certain food, like wheat. A second agricultural motivation for the Portuguese was to find a place to grow sugar. The demand for sugar had been extremely increasingly use in Europe, and although the Italians had been establishing their own sugar plantations for decades, others wanted to find land, hopefully in the Pacific, that they could use for their sugar plantation. These motives continued. So, in addition to seeking land for the resources of cultivation, Europeans also focused on establishing viable trade routes that gave them more direct access to trade. While there were many areas in which they were interested, their primary objective was to establish a trade route to Asia that they could control. So they went from Asia to Africa and then along to other lands. So the Europeans had established trade contacts with Africa through Muslim merchants, but they wanted to create their own direct contact for goods such as gold, ivory, and slaves. Although the Europeans had no idea that there was land to the west, their discovery of America created an additional trade route that Europeans desired to control. So although they weren't sure about it, this new trade route began to pop up. Even another reason for exploring was the spread of Christianity. Initially, Roman Catholic missionaries had accompanied explorers to help bring Christianity to the lands that they encountered. But in later stages, particularly in the British colonies in North America, Protestantism came to play a role in the establishment of religious ideas. They came specifically for that purpose. And one final motivation for exploration was the acquisition of gold, either for national prestige or for personal fame and power. Leaders of the European countries saw exploration, and later conquest, as an opportunity to build their own empires and increase national glory. Countries such as Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all sought to control trade routes and land that would make them more powerful. In addition, individuals saw exploration as an opportunity to gain public fame for themselves and to potentially become rich. Portugal was separated from the rest of Europe by land because its only border was with Spain. Additionally, it had convenient access to the Atlantic Ocean, enabling naval expeditions to continue. Due to its location on European sea lanes, Portuguese harbors were important ports for all of the fleets moving between Italy and northern Europe. This also enabled Portuguese sailors to gain a great deal of knowledge from other travelers, and they could use this in their own explorations. Prince Henry the Navigator, son of John I, the King of Portugal, began Portuguese exploration. Henry initially fought the Muslims in North Africa. He built a fleet to attack the Muslims in Ceuta and successfully took this city. However, conquering the land also showed Henry that there was great wealth in Africa. This led him to dream of exploration and conquest. Through his contact, Henry became enamored with the idea of gaining control of valuable trade routes in Africa and searched for ways to gain direct access and control to their gold, silver, spices, and many of the other luxury items in Africa. However, his father would not give him permission to wage a crusade directly in Africa, so he set off to discover another way to control African trade. So exploration became his main interest. Henry initially set out to explore the coast of Africa and traveled to Azores. However, he decided that he would create a support system for widespread navigation and exploration rather than exploring himself. Henry built a navigational school at Sagres in 1419 that supported and trained explorers. He brought in the map makers for the most current world maps and sought out the finest and most technologically advanced equipment. Prince Henry sought to expand profitable trade routes along the coast of Africa and into the Indian Ocean that would benefit Portugal. In addition, As a strongly religious man, he hoped to establish a Christian community along the coast of Africa to counter the impact of Muslims. During the 1420s, the Portuguese began to explore the western coast of Africa under the leadership of Henry's Navigational School. While they hoped to find a sea route to Asia, they also wanted to establish direct trade with Africa so they could avoid having to use African middlemen. As the Portuguese moved further along the African coast, Portugal began to establish trading posts. The Portuguese took advantage of these contacts and began trading for spices, like pepper, gold, and slaves. Of particular importance to them was the port of São Jorge da Mania, established in Ghana, known then as the Gold Coast. Portugal's involvement in the slave trade began as early as 1443 when Nuno Tristão purchased some slaves in Africa and took them back to be sold in Portugal. Within a few years, the Portuguese slave traders began to seek ways to exploit the African continent for their own gain. In 1452, the Pope issued a papal bull, making it acceptable for Europeans to enslave people considered infidels or pagans. The Portuguese used this papal declaration to justify their actions in Africa. A local slave trade already existed within the African continent. People in Africa were traditionally enslaved for several reasons. Individuals could be enslaved by a family or a group to settle a grievance. Criminals could be sold into slavery, and war captives could be forced into slavery themselves. The Portuguese discovered the slave system in Africa and sought to exploit it for their own use. However, in Africa, the slave systems that those enslaved were usually viewed not as property. So, to ensure them certain rights, they were still people, but the Portuguese saw the slaves as purely property. Lucrative economic opportunities on sugar plantations really pushed the Europeans to become deeply involved in slavery. Initially, the Portuguese sought to provide slaves for developing sugar plantations in the Mediterranean. Once the Americas had been discovered as another area that could support sugar plantations, the Portuguese sought to extend the slave trade to there as well. Next, we're going to talk about a man named Bartolomeu Dias. Dias was one of the explorers who had taken a trip down the coast of Africa on behalf of Portugal and was the man who King John II of Portugal chose to search for the sea route to the Indian Ocean. Dias set sail with 2 caravels and a supply ship that traveled along the entire western coast of Africa, reaching the tip of Africa and rounding the Cape in 1488. Dias named it the Cape of Storms, although the King of Portugal later named it the Cape of Good Hope because it provided proof that the sea route to India exists. Once Dias proved that such a route was possible, his crew essentially mutinied and demanded to return home. They forced Dias to go back to Portugal, and he lost the opportunity to become the first European to travel to India completely by sea. Dias never traveled to India, although he later helped da Gama build his fleet. In the end, Dias accompanies Gabriel into the Atlantic, but the ship he was commanding sank, and all of his men, including Dias, were lost. Early Portuguese explorers used the western coast of Africa to help them establish trade ports and to navigate around the continent as they searched for a sea route to Asia. The Portuguese came to the Congo in order to secure trading rights. Initially, the Congo was open to Portuguese, and trade and cultural exchange flourished. Many in the Congo even converted to Christianity. However, over time, the leadership of the Congo wanted to cut slave trade ties, something the Portuguese were not interested in doing. Consequently, the Portuguese conquered the Congo and then turned to find another group along the western coast of Africa with whom they could trade. Along the eastern coast of Africa, the Portuguese sought to control the lucrative gold trade in Zimbabwe and seized several cities to increase their control. In Mozambique, the Portuguese were also drawn to gold. However, their plans were complicated by the fact that Muslim traders were still actively involved in that region. In addition, Africans did not intend to easily give up their gold. So consequently, the Portuguese got involved in internal African affairs in the hopes of controlling more gold in their trade. They met with mixed emotions and mixed results with basically meddling in the African affairs.